So today's Saturday, Tuesday, we'd spoken a little bit about the culture that surrounds Vaishnavism, and we mentioned that the culture is designated or developed through the injunctions of Scripture, through the practice of sadhana, through the guidance we get from our acharyas and from Scriptures about what are proper activities and what are improper activities, and that creates the culture, and that culture is simply how the pure devotees act. And I was thinking about this today, and one thing that had come to mind was how the Vaishnava culture is very refined. And one of the things that many of us may not realize is that we don't really live in a human society. As Prabhupada said, I've come to make animals humans. So what we take as being human is not entirely human. And what we may take as being very elevated in terms of behavior or consciousness, by traditional standards, at least traditional standards within ancient society of India, the Vaishnava or Vedic society, this was just what would be considered civilized human behavior. To be forgiving, not to get angry, to be kind, to help those who are suffering, to be generous, to feed the hungry and so forth, to plant trees, to do pious activities, to be honest, to be straightforward and so forth, were considered activities that all human beings followed, of all castes. And only those who were outcasts, or outside the forecast. Outcast means actually outside the forecast, outside Varnashram, would be considered less than human. And now Kali Yuga has progressed, and much of what we take for granted in the behavior of people is actually less than human. And so a lot of what we're learning in Krishna consciousness is just how to be human. As strange as it sounds, first you have to be human, and then from human you can practice spiritual life. If you're not even human, then how do you practice spiritual life? So for example, in traditional societies for thousands of years, people understood that sex is for procreation and you do it within marriage to have children. And now in our society today, because of so-called sexual liberation, and people have a hard time understanding that if you say sex is for having children, they'll argue. They won't agree. They'll say, no, it's for pleasure. Although it's obvious that when you have sex, it produces children. And children should be taken care of by two parents. So that people never had difficulty understanding that. Now people have, for some reason, have difficulty understanding that because they've become less than human beings. And so, in our practice of Krishna consciousness, we bring, due to our conditioning, a lot of these less than human tendencies, attitudes, beliefs, doctrines, and characteristics to Krishna consciousness. If you study the history of the world, you'll see that the world has been influenced by a certain kind of thinking throughout history, and thinking changes. And as thinking changes, then the whole way people think changes. For example, there was a time when people believed the world was flat, and no one had traveled across the ocean to actually test whether it's flat. I mean, it looked flat when you look out. And so finally Columbus traveled looking for India. He ended up in the what we call the West Indies now, and then America. And then he discovered the world was round, and that news was then broadcast to the world. But the older people who believed the world was flat, they didn't really change their opinion. It was the way they thought. That was their paradigm of the world, and that didn't change. But then the next generation, they were taught the world is round, so that they changed. So then all around the world, people understood, okay, here's a new view of the earth, a geographical view. But also philosophical views changed, and there was, what we call the Dark Ages, there was the Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, Scientific Age. If you look at the ancient philosophers, they were all theistic and very philosophical. As society progresses, people become more atheistic and mechanistic, whereas they're just looking at the universe mechanistically. I just heard a man speak, and he was describing different emotional states simply as chemical hormonal states. He said that when you feel this way, it's because of this hormone. When people gather together, it's because of this hormone. So the world has evolved to a way of thinking which is much different than it used to think. It's a mechanistic model, that things are mechanical. It's a scientific model, only what we can see and prove is true. And that's not the way it used to be. So it influences the thinking of millions of people. And 100, 200 years ago, people thought differently. During the time of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, people thought differently. They were more philosophical. People stopped being philosophical. So we're influenced by a certain way of thinking, and we're influenced by certain conditioning, societal conditioning for many lifetimes. And then we come to Krishna consciousness, and then we learn what is proper behavior, what is proper attitude, and what is improper. But it's not so easy, because we're habituated to thinking and acting and responding to situations in a particular way, which is not generally Krishna conscious. Now, the more sattvic you are, by nature, by your karma, by your upbringing, the easier generally it'll be to practice Krishna consciousness, because sattva guna is next to transcendence. The more we're conditioned by passion and ignorance, the further we are from transcendence, the more difficult it is. So there's one thing I wanted to focus on tonight in terms of etiquette, and it's more of a philosophical approach to etiquette. And I want to base it on something Prabhupada said in a lecture. He said if we're envious or if we're jealous, we're living in the material world. And another time he said, if we're envious and jealous, that's not Vaishnava, that's ordinary materialistic people. And so in terms of etiquette, it's very important to understand that when things disturb us in relationships, when people do things which we disagree with, when people do things which disturb us, that oftentimes our response to that could be disgust, it could be hatred, it could be envy, it could be jealousy, it could result in criticism, which may be malicious, it could result in vengeance, it could result in lack of exhibition of any kind of Vaishnava sentiment, Vaishnava speech, Vaishnava character. And so, in other words, it can result in a complete relinquishment of any trace of Vaishnava etiquette and simply be a response that comes from the mode of passion or ignorance. And we should be aware of this. And oftentimes, what happens, what I've seen, is when devotees disagree with one another, it could be a disagreement over philosophy. Oftentimes they attack one another, or they denigrate one another, or they criticize one another. And thus they relinquish the etiquette and the manners of a Vaishnava. And this is one very common way it happens. This morning I was reading an article, well, it was actually a conversation, where one of my godbrothers was speaking about the fault of Ritvik philosophy, and what he was saying is that when it's not that a third party is the one to judge who is your guru. It's up to the disciple to evaluate who the guru is. And that most of that evaluation is not an intellectual process, but rather it's a subjective process which takes place within the heart. So that when one, of course, we should understand what are the qualifications of a guru. It's not that he's saying we should be blind about that, but taking that for granted, that we understand that there are certain qualifications, but when seeking to find shelter in one of the many gurus who are qualified, ultimately it's the heart that will inspire that, because within the heart the person will feel trust, faith, inspiration, desire to surrender, desire to give himself to this person. And so he cited the conversation, which I also cited many times, when Prabhupada asked, how do you know Krishna is God? And then the devotees gave so many answers, and all the answers were right, but Prabhupada rejected all the answers. And he said, he was rejecting them on the basis of, well, it's just your faith in Scripture. Your Scripture says this. And then one devotee said, because we can feel Krishna's God. And Prabhupada said, yes, that's the answer. So there is experience which validates truth. And in this way, there's experience of coming in touch with the sadhu, and that experience inspires one. That experience brings one closer to Krishna. That experience empowers one and extracts from his heart the desire to serve Krishna. So he was making that point, that is ultimately how one knows who his guru is. And he was saying that the Ritvic philosophy is saying, well, none of Prabhupada's disciples can be guru, even though disciples may see them as guru, but they're saying, no, they're not guru. So that I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that we have so many gurus in our movement, and so thousands and thousands of devotees are inspired by them. But if someone adopts the Ritvic philosophy, then when they see that same person, they won't be inspired to give their life to that person, because they'll think they've been told this person is not guru. Prabhupada never empowered them to be guru, and therefore if they take that position, they're charlatans. And so, of course, that's blasphemous of those devotees. And so I was thinking how the Ritvic philosophy is grounded very much in criticism of anyone who takes the position of guru. And criticism is, to put it lightly, often it's grounded in very heavy blasphemy. And that is so far outside of what it means to be a Vaishnava, what it means to be a cultured person. And as I thought about it, I thought that really what that philosophy is doing is it's hardening the hearts of people so they can't actually see who is a guru. They can't have that faith anymore, because a poison has been put in their heart. And in reflecting on that, I thought that the basis of, or one aspect or foundational aspect of Vaishnavism is to create faith in Krishna conscious philosophy, and also to create faith in authority. And what Ritvicism is doing is it is undermining that faith. So it's really antagonistic in a very deep sense to the fundamental principles of Vaishnava culture and Vaishnava etiquette, which is to build trust and faith, and also to honor senior Vaishnavas and to appreciate them, and to encourage people to take guidance and shelter from them. So in Vaishnava culture and Vaishnava etiquette, this creation of faith in the heart of another person is fundamental and foundational to a person's spiritual advancement. So a devotee should never interfere or infringe upon a person's faith. That is entirely against everything Krishna consciousness stands for. Now, we are conditioned souls. We tend to sometimes be envious or jealous or critical. And so what we'll see often is that in certain situations, devotees may be very critical. And sometimes they're critical for just reasons. Their things are wrong. But the way they become critical can turn into something very negative or something outside the parameters of Vaishnava etiquette. It turns into severe criticism or blasphemy or minimization or just outright envy. And of course, there's got to be some envy for these other things to happen. So, in reflecting on this, I was thinking how we could say that Vaishnava culture is grounded in a high degree of respect for superior Vaishnavas, especially for senior Vaishnavas. And what we see going on within the Ritvik propaganda is that junior devotees are condemning and pulling down senior devotees. And that's nothing we've ever learned from any scripture. We've never learned it from Prabhupada. And we've never learned that from any teaching in terms of Vaishnava etiquette, because the teaching of Vaishnava etiquette is always that you honor and you respect your superiors. Even if your superiors make mistakes, still there's a certain level of respect and honor given to them. And if we can try to deal with those mistakes, but we don't deal with them in a blasphemous way. We don't go on the internet and publicly condemn people. So it's an important aspect of culture. You know, we've talked about it a little bit, maybe not extensively, but we did have some classes on respect. So it's a fundamental aspect of culture to honor superiors, even if you disagree with them. Just like sometimes Prabhupada disagreed with some of his godbrothers, but personally in their association, he always honored them as his godbrothers, as is the etiquette. So even, you know, even if you disagree with someone, still there's an etiquette of honoring them, of respecting them, and Prabhupada showed that. And we see that within those who propound Ritvikism. It's rare that we see that kind of respect, but we see severe criticism. So the very philosophy itself is, I don't want to say transcending, it's beyond the purview of proper Vaishnava etiquette. And so how can a philosophy be valid when it can't even fall within the realm of Vaishnavism, when it falls outside the realm to the level of severe criticism, which, as Prabhupada said, is symptomatic of those who aren't Krishna conscious. So it's interesting that a philosophy could be based on something which is not Krishna conscious and propose to be Krishna conscious, isn't it? I mean, think about it. Of course, I don't know if you're all aware of Ritvik philosophy and how it's presented, but the basic idea is that they don't believe that Prabhupada authorized anyone to become guru. Even though Prabhupada asked us to become guru, they don't believe that he actually authorized it. Jai Prem Kishore. And so anyone who takes the position of guru and initiates disciples, they have no regard for. Actually, they're very critical of. And they believe that anyone who does that is ill-motivated. And so their commentary on this always turns into criticism. That's putting it lightly. It more often turns into blasphemy. At least, I can't speak for every single person who ascribes to this philosophy, but generally, everyone I've heard, except for one devotee, was highly critical. And that's not anything that we're never taught to relate to senior devotees in that way. Either by Prabhupada or in our scriptures, there's no examples and stories. Actually, the examples are always the opposite, where we approach senior devotees humbly. Now, one time Prabhupada said something very interesting. He said, if you're envious of another god brother, then you should serve him. And you should recognize you're envious of him because he's better than you, or he's doing more service than you. So you should serve him. Isn't that interesting? So Prabhupada's, and also many letters where Prabhupada said, whenever there's friction, we have to learn how to get along. So, of course, Ritvik philosophy is creating a divide and therefore those who are Ritvik are really outside of ISKCON. And Prabhupada fought vehemently throughout his entire life to prevent any kind of friction within our organization or any kind of split. And so the point is that you may, I'm not saying they're right, but say for the sake of discussion, even though you may be right to remain unified, to avoid friction, to avoid any kind of splits, is the highest principle. Now, not everyone will agree with that, but if you study Prabhupada's teachings, you'll always see that when things went wrong and things were presented to him, he didn't focus as much on what was wrong as he did on focusing on tolerating and working things out and working together. That's what he focused on. So the argument that unity is truth is higher than unity is not supported in Prabhupada's response to any kind of difficulties devotees were having that were presented to him. He just didn't respond that way. He said, okay, you're right and you're wrong, therefore we're just going to, how should we say, we have to, prove this person wrong and condemn them, and until they acknowledge that, you don't have to work together. He never said like that. He never really, his angle wasn't who's right, but his angle was how to get along. So I wanted to make the point, I'm making the point, and I think I've made it, that one fundamental aspect of Vaishnava culture, one of the most fundamental aspects, is humility, which manifests in our ability to cooperate and work together, even when it's difficult, or like I like to say, work together even if you can't. Manifest in freedom from envy in our dealings, even if envy is there. But when I say manifest in freedom from envy, I mean dealings without envy. Even I may be envious, but I don't allow that to influence my actions, my thoughts, my attitudes, as far as I can control it. That's Vaishnava culture. That's one of the most fundamental aspects of Vaishnava culture. Because humility is foundational. It's in the items of knowledge. In Bhagavad Gita, humility is listed first because humility is required to receive knowledge. And one needs to approach a guru, and one has to approach a guru humbly, otherwise one can't receive knowledge. So it's a foundation of culture, and then built upon humility are all these other good qualities that enable one to advance in Krishna consciousness. Because without humility, there's going to be pride, there's going to be envy, there's going to be jealousy, there's going to be fault-finding, and these have nothing to do with Krishna consciousness. And these qualities and this nature has nothing to do with Vaishnavism. And my point is that we see so often, or devotees allow themselves so often, to be motivated or influenced by these things. And we should be aware of that whenever we're being influenced by these things, that is our malecha culture. Let's say, it's bewildering because you might be, let's say, trying to do service for Krishna, or trying to establish something which you think is what is right, or what Prabhupada wants, or prevent the movement, prevent a problem, or prevent a deviation, or whatever. But the means that you may be employing to do that may not be within Krishna consciousness. So then you may have the right cause, but the means which you're using to further your right cause are all not Krishna conscious. And so you have to be aware of that. And it's so easy to do that because we are so much conditioned by the modes of passionate ignorance, by non-Vaishnava qualities, social conditioning, outside of Krishna consciousness, lifetimes of samskaras, that we may think we are working for a Krishna conscious cause, but the means with which we work is not Krishna conscious. And you can expand that beyond just the qualities of lack of humility or enviousness and so forth, but you can expand that to any form of behavior that is not within the rules, is not stipulated by the rules and regulations within Vaishnavism, because outside those rules and regulations, then we lose our culture. So it's not that we just want to achieve goals, that we do want to achieve goals, but we want to achieve them by Krishna conscious means. Sometimes devotees find it easier to achieve goals without being so strict or adhering to Krishna conscious principles, because by nature, the mode of passion is just get it done somehow or other. But our culture is a culture of goodness, so we don't want to act in passion or ignorance, because it's not our culture. It's okay, I achieved something Krishna conscious, but I compromised on the culture. That's not what we want to do. It's really hot here and sweaty. You can drink and drink and drink and drink and drink more, and you're still thirsty. What to speak if you talk? You really get thirsty. So, Trinadapi sunichena torori vasihishana manina manadena kirtaniya sadahari. This verse is quoted many times. That we should be humble, we should be tolerant, we should respect others. This is the essence of Vaishnavism, and what Mahaprabhu is saying, this is how one can get a taste. Because at the end of this verse he says, Kirtaniya Siddhahari. Obviously, if you're chanting always, you have a taste. And so it's the lack of humility which undermines everything. I told you before, I don't know if you remember, but it's always interested me what causes criticism, and there are many causes, many reasons we do it. But one of the things I found so very interesting is Srila Bhaktisiddhanta saying, taking the part of conditioned soul, saying that the reason I find fault, because I lack any humility. Because when there's no humility, then there's criticism, because then you think everybody is worse than you. It's like Duryodhana. Krishna said, find someone better than you, and Duryodhana came back and said, I can't find anybody better than me. That means he saw everyone as lower than him. So that's not a very good consciousness for executing devotional service, obviously. So another aspect of humility is that it said that humility is the jewel of prema, so that when you become Krishna conscious, it manifests. So the more there's humility, the more there's Krishna consciousness. So obviously humility is a fundamental aspect of Vaishnava culture. It has to be, because it's the result of love of Krishna. It's also the means of getting there. Now, we've spoken before about the reality that I may be envious, but I should not act with envy. I may not be humble, but I shouldn't act out of pride. So there's no excuse where a devotee would say, well, look I'm not humble, so don't expect that I act humbly. No. We say, well, none of us are humble, but we expect that because you're practicing Krishna consciousness, you will act humbly. Now someone might say, but that's too much to ask, because how can you always be humble when you're not humble? The thing to understand is that when Prabhupada presented Krishna consciousness to us, by us I mean those who are taking it seriously, then he spoke to us as serious practitioners. And if you see Prabhupada's instructions, you'll look at some instructions and you'll say, well, that's heavy, or that's strict, or that's difficult to follow. Because he was speaking to us, those who are getting initiated, those who are seriously practicing. So in that sense, you could say, when Prabhupada's heavy, you could say, no, he's speaking to those who've dedicated their lives to Krishna consciousness. So it may sound heavy to say, no, you always have to act humbly. Even when people are not humble with you, even maybe people may try to take advantage of you in some ways. How can I be humble? Why should I be humble? I don't feel like being humble. It's not right to be humble. We may think that way, but Prabhupada's saying, no, if you're serious about Krishna consciousness, then you act humbly, even when it's difficult, even when you don't feel like it. That's the whole point. That it's a tapasya to act in ways which are difficult. Just like, for example, we've said before, that sometimes cooperating with others can be the most difficult austerity we'll ever have to perform. And we may find it almost impossible to sometimes cooperate with certain individuals because what they do and what they say may make absolutely no sense to us. It may even seem grossly wrong. It may even seem evil in some cases. And we're asked to cooperate. So how difficult is that? It's very difficult. And so Prabhupada asked us, you have to cooperate. Don't leave, work it out somehow or other, find your space. So we do that. Is it difficult? Yeah, it's difficult. And for some people, it's not. Some people don't find it as difficult as others. Some people find it extremely difficult. There are people, you may be one of them, that find it virtually impossible to cooperate with most people. It's their nature. But even those people, Prabhupada's asking, no, you must cooperate. This is required, it's necessary. So we should never say, well, I'm not humble, so I can't act humbly. We should just say, okay, this is what Prabhupada wants me to do, and for me it's going to be an austerity because by nature I'm not humble. Or I have to cooperate, and by nature it's difficult to cooperate. So if we take the attitude that I will do it because my spiritual asked me, that is really Vaishnava culture, because now you're willing to do what's necessary, whether it suits you or doesn't suit you, whether you think it's right or wrong, whether you think others are right or wrong. You're willing to do the right thing. And that's what Vaishnava culture is all about. It's the proper behavior in all circumstances, in all situations. Sometimes it's really difficult to act properly because you're not being treated properly. But as I've said many times, if we are not treated properly, that's never meant to be an excuse or give us license to retaliate or respond with non-Krishna conscious actions, words, attitudes, etc. Just because someone else did it to us is actually foolish. It's like saying, look, someone came into my house and stole all my jewelry, so I'm going to go in my neighbor's house and steal all their jewelry. Obviously that doesn't make sense. But when we respond to actions which we don't believe are Krishna conscious with words or actions or attitudes which are Krishna conscious, then what's the difference between that and someone saying, I have the right to steal because something has been stolen from me? We never have the right, we should never think we have the right to act in ways which aren't Krishna conscious because life isn't fair or we weren't treated properly. Now, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was so adamant about this that even if someone made a mistake, which everyone agreed was a mistake, he didn't want the devotees to condemn that person because he said whether the criticism is justified or not, we shouldn't focus on criticism. Now, in some cases, we have to act because what a person has done is wrong, and we have to protect innocent people and prevent further injustice from being done. But his point is that when that's not necessary, we should refrain from criticism, and even when it is necessary, we should refrain from any kind of malicious behavior, malicious attitudes, or so forth. And because he said something which is so interesting, that even if what the person does is wrong, the criticism is also wrong. If we're dwelling on a person's faults extensively, even if the faults are objectively verifiable, still it's wrong. And we don't think like that. We think, well, if the person did something wrong and I'm focused on their faults, then it's okay. It may be okay in some situations. I'm speaking generally here, and I'm speaking idealistically here of what is the proper behavior in most cases, is that we should never feel that we're justified in acting in a way which isn't Krishna conscious. That's the whole point. We're never justified in acting in a way which isn't Krishna conscious, just because actions were perpetrated against us that were not Krishna conscious. We don't have a right to retaliate with actions which are non-Krishna conscious. Of course, we have the freedom, we have the independence to do it. But as devotees, we can't gather any backing for that from any Shastra or any instruction from Srila Prabhupada, unless we have to do something to defend our movement. Then we will retaliate and respond in order to protect Krishna's movement, Krishna's possessions, Krishna's service like that. That's different. So, it's an important principle. In all our dealings with one another, what it means to be a Vaishnava, what it means to be a devotee, is that the dealings are respectful. We maintain a humble position, not artificially. Oh, yes, Prabhu, I'm your servant, but you don't mean it. Not artificially, but we maintain a humble position, which means we don't think that every word that issues from our mouth is absolute truth. We recognize that we can be wrong, we recognize we can make mistakes, we recognize other people may know things which we don't know. And our goal in life is not to prove to the world that we're right and everybody's wrong. That has nothing to do with Krishna consciousness. And it has nothing to do with humility. So we should understand that not only is humility a foundational aspect of Vaishnava culture, it's a foundational aspect of Krishna consciousness. And it's one of the ways in which you judge your advancement. So Ganesha says that it's a nice point. We should not feel justified for acting in a non-Krishna conscious way, even if non-Krishna conscious actions were perpetrated against us. There's no... You don't find disclaimers in our Shastra that, these are the activities of a devotee, these are the attitudes of a devotee, or like Prabhupada says in his books, a pure devotee always does this, or a pure devotee never does this. He outlines the actions of a pure devotee, outlines the characteristics of a pure devotee, he outlines the behavior of a pure devotee. And where do you see that? Prabhupada says it's okay for the pure devotee to not act as a pure devotee when he's not being treated as a pure devotee. You don't see that. Now, sometimes a devotee, like you have the example Hanuman, that he fought and he burned Lanka, he did so many things, but that was in the service of Krishna. So he was angry, but his anger wasn't on his own account, so it wasn't material. So then sometimes a devotee may exhibit some kind of transcendental anger, transcendental pride, transcendental envy, which is not material. That's there. And a devotee will do things to protect Krishna's movement, protect Krishna's service. That's there also. but still he'll never act outside the injunctions or instructions given in Shastra or from his guru. He'll never find a rationale for doing that. So it's said, Lord Chaitanya said to Sanatana Goswami that the behavior, proper behavior, the etiquette is the ornament. It's the ornament of Vaishnava on the head of the Vaishnava. It's his ornament. So that's what it means to be Krishna conscious. And I think one of the ways we're challenged to act as Vaishnavas is in relationships, in dealings, both with devotees and outside devotional society, with people in general. Because you take this point, Guru Nishta, and then some devotees might think, well, in the association of devotees, I should act properly, but with non-devotees, it's not necessary. So that would be the same idea, that we're thinking that the behavior is not a 24/7 behavior, it's conditional, based on situations, based on who I'm dealing with, and so forth. But when we talk about Vaishnava etiquette, it doesn't mean Vaishnava etiquette is only done with Vaishnavas. It means that if you're a Vaishnava, then you act with the etiquette of a Vaishnava, with everybody. Just like sometimes they'd ask Prabhupada, well, now that I become a devotee, how do I deal with my parents? And Prabhupada said, when you see them, bow down. You think, well, that's strange, but that's actually standard for a devotee. So even though the devotee's mother is not a devotee, Prabhupada said, bow down. Then what's Vaishnava behavior? Show affection to friends. So Prabhupada said, when you see your friends, be affectionate. So the point is, we have our standard of behavior, and it's not supposed to change when we interact with non-devotees. Just like there's a story, I don't know, I think this is funny, but there was a devotee, he was doing some business and he was selling paintings, and then people invited him in and they offered him some wine, and he didn't want to be rude, so he drank it. And you're thinking, why did he drink the wine? That's crazy. And yes, it is crazy. But he was thinking, well, I have to compromise to be friendly with them, or to reciprocate. They bought a painting and they want me to reciprocate. But we should always think, no, we have our principles and we stick to those principles. Just like the story I've told before of a factory that was sold to a Muslim, and all the workers were Hindus. So then when the Muslim took over the factory, he said that Hindus are not allowed to wear any kind of tika or tilak or marking on their forehead. And one Vaishnava, he said, no. Said to himself, no, I will wear tilak. This is what I do. This is just who I am. And so he wore tilak to the factory, but none of the other Hindus did. And then the owner of the factory said, you can wear your tilak every day, because you had the guts, so to speak, to do what was true to your religion. And so I think that's a nice story where this person had their principles, and they weren't going to give up their principles for any reason. So that's how we should be. We have our principles. So whatever's going on around us, we still maintain the Vaishnava etiquette with everyone. We still maintain our principles. It's like, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we talk in Vaishnava etiquette and in Vaishnava theology in general, that there should be respect for authority. So, traditionally people respected presidents, king, queens, and so forth. So you'll see in Prabhupada's correspondence with government officials, he respects them as they are meant to be respected, or how they are within the particular etiquette or social custom. He respects them, because those persons are still traditionally representatives of God, who have those government posts. So, not that he agrees with what they did, but he maintained that culture of respect by respecting the post, respecting the person who has the post. So that's okay, we can do that. Yes? We can do it. We can maintain that. That's all right. All right, so I'm going to stop here. I think that was what the point I wanted to make, that whenever you see any kind of interaction between devotees which is not revealing sympathy, appreciation, humility, and so forth, then we understand that the behavior is not Krishna conscious. It's outside the purview of our culture. And we should be very wary if a whole philosophy is presented to rationalize criticism. That's sad and sick. Okay. So, we have 12 minutes left. If I don't fall asleep, we have 12 minutes left. And if you'd like to ask some questions, I'll just close my eyes and sit here and take it easy. I was up at 1:30, I think 1:30 this morning, so it's now 8:30. So, yes, a little tired. This class was kind of the essence of all the Vaishnava etiquette classes, because everything in Krishna consciousness is so much based around good relationships, relationship with Siksha and Diksha gurus, relationships with equals, seniors, juniors. There's a proper way of behaving and interrelating, which fosters Krishna consciousness. And so, particularly when we're dealing with superiors and equals, there's a lot of room for envy and jealousy. And if we're to make these relationships Krishna conscious, then we have to eliminate that from those relationships. So Prem Kishore has a statement or question. It's a real austerity to work with negative people, but if it is possible to surround yourself around people who are positive, why not do that? Yes, okay. If you can. If you're in a situation that you have no choice, then you must tolerate it. But if you have a choice to associate with positive people, why not? Yes. Sometimes I think devotees beat themselves in the head to work with certain people where it might be very conducive. Yes, true. Because false concept of tolerance. It seems one should ideally always behave to Vaishnava etiquette, but also seek best association. Yes. So, that's true. But then, it's quite common that you'll end up in situations where you're not always with people, where you might be with people who are negative or pessimistic or critical and so forth. Now, as far as being with people critical, our scriptures say that it's damaging for you to hear criticism. And so therefore you're not entirely obligated to closely associate with them. And I think you could extend that and say, well, it's damaging for me to be around negative people. And that may be true. And if it is, you may be able to turn them around, make them positive. But if it's true that they're having a negative effect on you, then you should avoid that association. My point is that you're not always going to, sometimes you're going to have to work with people that aren't like that, and you don't have a choice of not working with them. So then you always have to take the right attitude, even if they don't. Prabhupada's instructed that often when he would say, when somebody would criticize, and he'd say, well, just set an example yourself of the kind of behavior that you want others to follow. So that's always there. So you're not being treated well, but still you respond properly. I think also you could rephrase your question in a way that, you know, if you're really positive, then I think two things will happen. The negative people will become positive, and the negative people that don't become positive won't want to be around you because you're too positive. Does that make sense? It's kind of an interesting concept, right? Don't you think? Okay, I'm going to move up in the world. No, I can't. I can move down in the world. So I would strive for that position, to see if I can turn negative people positive. Now you look at Prabhupada, he had to work with all kinds of people. So he would often say, you know, there was a lot of reason for me to be discouraged, but I wasn't. So it's a high degree of tolerance. In other words, what you say is true, but not at the expense of being intolerant. But if you're working with a group of very positive devotees who like working together, yes, that's wonderful. And we should strive for that, desire that, and be an agent to make people positive, bring out the best in them. Okay, any other questions before I collapse? I think I've already collapsed. Before I collapse even more. Now Anuradha's going to say, Gurudev, you should go to sleep. Right, Anuradha? You're about to type that, right? You're so tired, you should go to sleep. Yeah, I might just fall asleep in the middle of a sentence. So Prem Kishore saying that, yeah, there should be a balance of seeking good association and being good association. If you're good association, then you can make a lot of negative people possible. And it is true that some negative people you can't make possible. And I would say what Prem Kishore is saying is true, that you have to be wary not to put too much energy into trying to make them positive, because it may not be possible. So Atmananda is authorizing me to take rest. So since he's authorizing it, then I might as well, because he knows what he's talking about. And I'm quite tired, and I think I made my point. So I ask your permission. For you it's the morning, for me it's the evening. Ask your permission to let me go, and we will see you on Tuesday evening.